Hello friends, welcome to today's session, and today we are going to take a look at different types of IP addresses. So IP types, and let's dig down what are the different types of it. So we have public IP address and private IP address, but today we are going to specifically talk about public IP address. So let's understand what is public IP. So a public IP address is an IP address that your home or business router receives from your ISP. So example, like the IP 111.125.20.93. This is a public IP address. It is used when you access the internet. So think of this public IP as your web address, just like you have your home address. So just imagine when you are traveling through any of the road which is publicly accessible road, you see some shops to your left and to your right. So these shops are accessible by public, like you can directly get down the road and visit those shops. So these shops are meant for accessing, to be accessed by public, right? You can visit those shops and buy your products as well, right? So these are exposed to public, and these actually are meant to serve public. In the same way, this public IP address is used for, just take an example of your website. So your website is kind of brand or is used for selling your product, marketing your products, right? So now your website, which is hosted on internet, now it would get or is expected to receive traffic from public over internet. So that's why it's meant to have a public IP, an IP which everyone can visit over. So that's nothing but a public IP. Public IP addresses are required for any publicly accessible network hardware such as your home router and the servers that host website. So something that I already explained. So any network hardware that you want to expose to the public, or you want public to access, for example home router. So you, when you need internet at your home, you install a router which would get a public IP. So, or if you host a website which is to be accessed by public, that would need to have this public IP. So what does public IP address do? So each device that accesses the internet uses this unique IP addresses. So in our yesterday's lecture, we discussed IP address is a unique name for that host, or for the server, for communication. In the same way, if I want to, so let's say I have a site, shyamkukreja.com. Now, when you want to access this site, it would have a public IP because I want people to browse this site. So this public IP helps, whenever you type keyword in search at like shyamkukreja.com in your Google, what happens is it gets the IP of this shyamkukreja.com domain, and then it's down the network, it goes to the server where my website is hosted, and it gets the web page and it shows you in the Google, or sorry, in your browser. So that's how it gets the page. It connects to my server which has got this public IP, and it shows you the page. So that's how the connection happens. Public IP address differentiates the devices that are plugged into public internet. So just like we studied, different people have different names, and you can refer to specific person by his or her name. In the same way, public IP addresses are unique. So whenever you want to talk to a specific host, you can refer to that host by public IP. And each host device, would have different unique public IP. And think of this as your address on web, just like I said. So you have your home address and your personal office address. In the same way, whatever website you have, so think of your this address as your website address. So shyamkukreja.com, you can remember it. IP no one can remember. That's why. So we link this host name like shyamkukreja.com, sorry, the website name, or you can call it domain name server. We will again discuss over DNS at some later point, but we will link shyamkukreja.com with some public IP, because you won't be able to remember public IP of my website. So that's how it is done. A public IP address is sometimes also called as internet IP. So people ask you, what is your internet IP? So that is nothing but your public IP. And let me quickly show you how to check that. So if you go into Google and you type what is my IP, you'll see this website, the very first website, whatismyip.com. And if you click on it, so it would show you this kind of IP. So right now I'm connected via my home router, and the IP that my router has got is 111.125.20.93. So this is the public IP of my router, and this is my public IP, you can say. Next, what are different types of public IP? So again, there might be two types of public IP: dynamic IP and static IP. So dynamic IP is where the IP address might change. So if I reboot my router, if I kind of switch it off and switch back again, switch it on again, the IP might change, because here I don't need a static IP, fixed IP. I mean, it's okay if the IP address changes. So when you reboot your home router, but the static IP, so here the IP address remains same. And the best example for this is my website. So for my website, if I host since I'm hosting a website, I want IP to remain constant, so that some public people who remember that IP, or who are used to that IP, they should not get diverted, right? So when I go for registration of domain name, I can also go for this static IP. So static is kind of fixed IP. And again, yes, I'll have to pay additional charges for the static IP, since I will have to reserve it for 1 year, 3 year, or and so on. So of course those would be applicable, but you can have this option to have static IP or dynamic IP. So that's what we had in a quick session over public IP. Let me know your views in the comment section, and we will meet in our next discussion to discuss more on private IP address. So see you in the next section. Goodbye.